particular book and chapter and continue the discussion on what we believe. And we're talking about what we believe about God. It's very interesting, this particular book and chapter. For the first time, God speaks. God speaks to a group of people, a mass group of people. For this is the first time God spoke to a group. And other times, if you read the Bible, God speaks to individuals. But God speaks, and he speaks very clear to a group of people who are indebted to God. They are indebted because God has done for them what no other God had ever done for people. And I want to look at this because I've been telling you about who God is. I wanted to give you the attributes and the nature of God and tell you that God is sovereign, God is omnipotent, God is all powerful, God is all knowing, and God is loving, and God is merciful, God is gracious, and God is kind. The multitude of God's mercies. We could never exalt the multitude of the mercies of God that he extends to us. And I wanted to tell you about who God was and who God is and who God can be to you. But this God is a personal God. He's just not a God sitting up in the sky cosmically running and organizing, and he's just not sitting up there looking down. But God is personally involved in his creation, especially the creatures that he created, and that's you and I. But in this particular text, we're going to see a personal God, a God who takes a personal interest in a specific group of people that he has chosen to be his people. And we're going to see that God has some demands and some expectations. God just doesn't deliver them because they needed delivering, but God had a purpose behind delivering them. God in this particular text is going to demonstrate exactly what he expects and what he demands. You really don't understand Exodus chapter 20 until you read Exodus chapter 19. Exodus chapter 19 is a very important chapter to consider before you read Exodus chapter 20, because in Exodus chapter 19, we're going to listen to God speak to Moses to give the people some instructions before they come into the presence of God. Most of the time, all we read is Exodus chapter 20, and we read God giving them the 10 commandments. But before God gave them the 10 commandments, we have Exodus chapter 19. And if you would, as a point of devotional study, read Exodus chapter 19, God had an expectation. The people had to get prepared in order to go into the presence of God, because they're going to meet God at Mount Sinai 3 months after they had now been delivered from Egypt. And in the 3rd month, they're going to meet God at the mountain. This particular mountain, Sinai, was a significant place because Sinai is where Moses literally met God, and God revealed himself through the burning bush. Sinai is where Moses received the instructions to go to Egypt. And so now the people had been delivered from Egypt, and now they're going to go back where Moses first met the Lord, where God showed up and spoke to Moses and told him to go to Egypt. Now they're going to go back to the place where God had designated where Moses were to take the people after they had exited from Egypt. But it is very significant because in Exodus chapter 19, God is going to give Moses some specific instructions. He's going to tell Moses to tell the people to prepare themselves, to sanctify themselves, to consecrate themselves before they come to the mountain of God, to meet with God, to hear God speak. And it's very significant that you just cannot come before God any kind of way. You got to make sure that when you get ready to come before the presence of God, you have to sanctify yourself. You're going to have to consecrate yourself. In other words, you got to get yourself right. One of the things that Moses is going to tell the people that God told him to tell the people was to tell them to wash their clothes. They had to be right. They had to be clean, not only on the outside. They couldn't just come to God. And it wasn't God saying to them that the garments that they had wasn't good enough, but God wanted to convey the message that you just couldn't come to him like you went everywhere else, that there needed to be a difference in the way you came into the presence of God, to Sinai, to meet God, to hear God speak. You had to get yourself right. You had to clean yourself up. You had to act as if though you were coming into the presence of a holy God. And so in chapter 19, Moses is going to speak to the people and tell them that the Lord wants them to wash their garments, to clean themselves up. But he also tells them that you got to make sure that when you come into the presence of God, that you don't get too cocky and arrogant. Because you're not to touch the mountain. You're not to go near the mountain. As a matter of fact, God gave Moses the instructions to those who were in the army or the guards of the camp of Israel. If anybody gets too close and think they have a right to come into the presence of God and touch the mountain, shoot them with an arrow or stone them with a stone. He wanted them to understand that even though you had access to the presence of God, don't think you deserve to be there. Don't walk up in here like God owes you something, that you deserve to be in the presence of God, and that you're holy enough or right enough to come into the presence of God. He says, when you come into the presence of God, make sure you come with reverence and respect. Don't come up in here like you deserve to come into God's presence. And so Moses had to tell them, God wants you to wash your garments, but he also wants you to approach this mountain, which represents his presence, and God is going to come down and he's going to meet with you at Mount Sinai. He wants them to understand that. And so before you get to chapter 20, all we talk about is the commandments. But before God gave the commandments, God wanted his people to understand there is a requirement. You need to be sanctified, set apart, but you also need to be consecrated. And consecration has to do with what is in your heart. You got to make sure that you are clean on the outside, but you're consecrated on the inside. That you understand you are entering into the presence of a holy God. And then he's going to tell them, because God has chosen you, he has chosen you as a kingdom of priests. In verse 6 of chapter 19 of Exodus, he says God has chosen you as a kingdom of priests. And he has chosen you as a holy nation. The word holy literally means to be sanctified. It does not mean to be perfect, but it means to be set aside. God has set you aside as priest, as his representative. He has set you aside as a holy nation so that you can be separated from other nations. He's really saying to them that you are to be different. You are to look different. You are to act different. Everybody else has been serving gods, but not the true and living God. But I have set you aside as priests to represent me, as a holy nation to be sanctified, so that I can send you into other nations so that you can tell them about God. And so he really wants them to understand all of that. He's just kind of laying out the foundation that you cannot enter into the presence of God any kind of way. You got to get yourself right. And if modern church folk could get that, you can go into any other environment any kind of way, but when you come into the presence of God, you ought to clean up yourself on the outside, which simply means to sanctify yourself. Yeah. But you also need to consecrate yourself, because you're coming into the presence of a holy God. Yeah. And so that's what he wants him to understand in this particular text. And so chapter 19, Moses is getting the people ready to go to the mountain of Sinai, and God is going to come down. And the way it is described in chapter 19, it would scare any of us, because when God showed up at the mountain of Sinai, there was a loud noise. The noise was so loud that it frightened the people. And then God came down in the form of fire, but it was not like on Pentecost, This fire from heaven that represented the presence of God came down and it shattered the mountain. It caused this earthquake. It caused these clouds to form, because this was God meeting his people at the place where he had designated, because God wanted to speak to his people. He wanted his people to be sanctified and consecrated before they came into his presence. He wanted them to understand, you are priests, you are a holy nation. I want to tell you now what I'm expecting of you. And so here we see these people now coming into the presence of God. And then God is going to descend down like smoke, and smoke in the form of this fire, and it's going to be like a furnace, and the whole mountain is going to just shake and tremble. And listen, sometimes when we come into the presence of God, we don't need to come as if though God owes us something, but we need to come in fear and in trembling. And that's the problem that we have in this modern age. We don't fear and tremble in the presence of God. We're not afraid of God. We're not scared of God. We're so big and bad. But my brothers and sisters, I'm so scared and afraid of God in the sense that I tremble in his presence that I run in the house when it's lightning and thunder. Because I understand that that is something that is greater than me, more powerful than me. And even that very act sends fear throughout my body. It was just like that event. And sometimes we are to approach God with such fear and trembling. Then we come to verse number 1 of chapter 20. And God literally has consecrated this mountain, and he's now sanctified and consecrated his people, and now they are gathered. And God has already given the rules. He says, I don't want you to touch the mountain because you're not clean enough, holy enough, right enough, but I do want you in my presence so that I can speak. And when they got there, God started speaking. And we have in chapter 20, verse 1 and verse 2, God speaking. And my brothers and sisters, if I really gave this chapter the proper time and the proper attention that it rightfully deserves, I wouldn't make it past verses 1 and 2. Because God is going to lay out a very compelling argument of why he is saying what he's saying in the verses preceding verses 1 and 2. Because it would be literally something that wouldn't have a lot of weight if God didn't say what he said in verses 1 and 2. Because in verses 1 and 2, God lays out an argument of why he is saying what he's saying in the verses preceding verses 1 and 2, because if you just took verse 2 alone, you would have a reason to listen to God. You would have a reason to give God your attention, because God is going to lay out the argument of why he's going to say what it is he's going to say, and why he's going to have some demands and some expectation of his people. You know, sometimes when you do something for somebody that you don't have to do, there is an expectation that you have, some things they ought to do in response to what you have done for them. This is literally the argument that God is going to lay out in chapter 20. So the 10 Commandments are not just rules randomly, but they are rules in response to what God has done. If you go back to Exodus chapter 1, you will discover that it was the people of God, the descendants of Jacob that were literally slaves in Egypt. And God called Moses at this very same mountain and said, you go down there and tell them that I have heard their cry, and I've seen their suffering by reason of their taskmasters. And you go down there and tell them that I have come to deliver them. They were in bondage. They were slaves in Egypt for almost 400 years, and it was God who came down and went to Egypt and delivered them. And now God is finished to remind them how they got out of that situation. And my brothers and sisters, if the truth be told, if you would just testify, quit being so arrogant, quit being so proud, you would testify that the Lord had brought you from a mighty long way. God have got you out of some situations where you were under some suffering and some suffrage, and if God hadn't got you out, if God hadn't brought you through, you wouldn't be where you are right now. Do I have any witnesses in here? You were just like the children of Israel. You were suffering by reasons of your taskmaster. You could not free yourself. You could not get yourself out of that in bondage, in that situation that had you in bondage. You couldn't get your situation out, but you looked up and you cried out to God, and God came and got you out of that situation. And so God is just to make this argument before he starts giving commandments. He's going to really give a reason why he's given these commandments. And my brothers and sisters, you shouldn't be afraid. You shouldn't be timid about obeying a God that has done what this God has done. Because look at what the text says in this particular chapter. Because it starts out and God spoke all of these words, saying, this is God speaking to his people. I've already told you, Exodus chapter 1, he told Moses, tell him I'm coming to get them. And I don't have to remind you all God did to get his people out. And God did a lot to get his people out, to bring his people back to himself so that he could make them a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And now God is fixing to tell them, this is what I'm expecting and this is what I am demanding from you. Yeah. So, my brothers and sisters, God doesn't do all that he does for us and then expects nothing in return. Yeah. You owe God something. There is a psalm that says, what do I owe God for all of his benefits toward me? Some of us have an indebtment with God because we know if it had not been for the Lord on our side, if the Lord hadn't got us out, brought us through, and carried us when we could not carry ourselves. I need somebody that will testify with me. You owe God something. You have a debt, an indebtment with God. If you lived 1,000,000 years and could serve God all 1,000,000 years faithfully, it still wouldn't be enough to repay him for all that he has done for you. And let me tell you, this is what God says before he starts giving this commandment. First, God identifies himself, and I could stop right there. He says, I am. Listen, they know who the I am is. If they don't know, Pharaoh, the deceased and dead Pharaoh knew who the I am was. Moses knew who the I am was. Because he said, go down to Egypt and tell Pharaoh, I said, let my people go. And Moses said to him, who shall I tell him that sent me? And God said, tell him I am. And that I am is packed with a lot of power. You know, I was telling you about the nature and the attributes of God, and all of those attributes and natures of God are wrapped up in the I am. Do I have any witnesses in here? There's a whole lot of good things, listen, in the I am. The I am is like Campbell vegetable soup. There's a whole lot of good things in it. And not just one good thing, but a whole lot of good things in the one thing. And he says, I am. God really introduces himself to his people because they had only heard about God through Moses. But now God introduces himself. Moses told them who the I am was. They really didn't hear from God. They really didn't hear God speak. But this is the first time that I am is speaking to the people that he had just delivered. And this is God introducing himself. And some of us need to be reintroduced to God simply because we think we're gods ourselves. We have made our own selves the gods that we think is keeping us, that's sustaining us, that's given to us. But we need to be reintroduced to the God of the Bible. Because sometimes God can bring us so far through so much, and we can think that we are the reason why we are where we are. But we need to be reintroduced to the I am. And this is what he says: I am the Lord your God. Oh, listen, I don't even have time. I am the Lord your God. And listen, then God is listen, it's enough in here for me to preach a month. I am the Lord your God who brought. Man, I can stop right there at that word brought. Because if the truth be told, they didn't get nowhere without God. They didn't overcome anything without God. They didn't get through nothing without God. They didn't defeat an army without God. And they didn't draw a sword, but they defeated the greatest army in the whole world because of God. He said, the God that brought you. They didn't build a bridge to get over the Red Sea. It was God. God was the one that brought them out. My brothers and sisters, and if I had time, I'd explain to you. He brought them out of Egypt. And Egypt represents a place of bondage. Egypt represents a place where the people couldn't be all that they wanted to be. They had to work and live under servitude of those who oppressed them. But not only did they oppress them, but they mistreated them. Not only did they mistreat them, they caused them suffering. They made them work all day without wages. They killed their children. You remember, because of the population control, they killed the first male born of every Jewish person, every Israelite. They suffered great under the Egyptians. But God says, I have brought you out of Egypt. All that you went through, all that you were suffering, all of the pain, the agony, the trouble that you were in and under, I am the one that brought you out. Not only did I bring you out, and this is the reason why you ought to shout sometimes, because God says, not only did I bring you out, but I handled the problem that was the problem you had when you were in Egypt. Because you remember when they were at the Red Sea, Moses told them to turn around and look. He says, these Egyptians you see today, you won't see them no more. And not to say that they're not going to have any more problems with any more people, but God was going to deal with this problem. The problem that got you in the situation you were in the first place, God says you ain't going to have them as a problem anymore. It doesn't mean you're not going to have any problem, but there are some people that's a problem to you. God is going to eventually deal with them, and he's going to deal with them not in a private way, but in a public way. It's going to be in a grand way that the whole world will know that you are a child of God. He says, I'm the God that brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And that word bondage it encompasses a lot. It encompasses a lot. This is God just making an argument. And I'm almost finished, but let me tell you, this is God making a compelling argument of why he has the right to give them a prohibition, or give them some laws, give them some commandments. And see, you might think it's unfair that God told Adam not to eat of one tree, but gave him thousands of trees to eat off of, because God can give instructions and commandments and laws because he is the lawgiver. He is a sovereign God. He is the creator of all things. He is a self-existing God. And the God who has all power in his hand can manage and can regulate the creation and regulate the creatures that he created. And here God again saying to them, I can tell you why I'm going to give you some laws, some commandments, because I'm the one that brought you out of Egypt. I'm the one who brought you out of the house of bondage. And my brothers and sisters, if you could just stop for a minute and pause and think about what the God brought you out of and what the God brought you from under that was a bondage and a burden, you ought to be willing to serve God, to obey the commandments of God, and to do right by God. That's the argument God is going to make. And he's really going to give three real strict prohibitions, three real strict laws, three real strict commandments. And I tell you, this is not asking much. This is really not asking much. What God is asking in these first three commandments, it's not really asking much. It's the same thing a husband would ask a wife if he asked her to marry her and she pledged to accept that invitation for matrimony. His expectation is that she is to love him, to honor him, to obey him, and to love him in his sickness and in health, and through wealth and poverty and prosperity and through difficulties. That's all he's expecting, because he has done his part to accept and to choose her as a spouse, and then she has a responsibility. That's just the minimum expectation. It's a whole lot of other stuff that is involved. And the same thing as a parent pledges to a child that because I brought you into the world and it's my job to take care of you, and the only thing you are supposed to do is to honor me. And in that word honor, it's a whole lot. It is to respect. It is to show me the minimum amount of respect. Is to respect me when you are young and when I get old. That's all. It's just an expectation that because I did this, you ought to do this. This is what God is really communicating to his people. Now, God is fixing to lay out three very, very weighty prohibitions, laws, or commandments. And I just want to look at them because God is going to He's going to explain them in detail. The first thing God said, you shall have no other God before me. Now listen, that's not hard. It shouldn't be hard for them. I mean, listen, I studied this, Butch, and what it tells me is that this is a very interesting commandment because of what happened in Egypt. Because they were in Egypt for almost 400 years, and for about 400 years they were in Egypt, and they were familiar with the gods of Egypt. And Egypt had a whole lot of gods. The Egyptians had a whole lot of gods. The Pharaohs had a whole lot of gods, but their top 10 gods. I'm trying to explain something to you, because little G-O-D-S, that's little gods, and so they were familiar with the gods of Egypt, and there were a whole lot of them. But the top 10 gods that the Egyptians had, that the Israelites were familiar with, God defeated all 10. Do I have any witnesses in here? God, listen, the top 10 gods that they had in Egypt that the Israelites were familiar with, over 400 years they were familiar with these gods that the Egyptians worshiped, and the 10 plagues represents the 10 gods that God defeated, all 10 of them. Yeah. And then listen, the last one was this image of this god, that Horus, that the Pharaoh prayed to when his son died, but God defeated that god. Every one of the gods of Egypt that were the top 10 gods, God defeated every one of them. You remember the Nile was a god. It was a mighty river that not only flowed downstream, but every now and then it would flow upstream. God defeated that god. Every god that they had in Egypt, God defeated. The top 10, there were more than 10, but the top 10, the best that the Egyptians had to offer, God defeated all 10. And so God says, the first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And if I had time, I'd break it down to you and explain to you that God understood they would have little G-O-D, that's just God's small ones. But he says you better not put them before me, because we are a religious people. People are just religious. We love to worship things. We love to worship. You got to worship something. There is a throne in your soul and in your heart, and you're going to put something on that throne. You're going to worship something. Something will be the object of your affection. Something will be the object of your adoration. Something will be the object of your devotion. You're going to worship something. I know that you say to me, listen, I only worship God. But my brothers and sisters, if we only worship God, God wouldn't have to give us this commandment. God knows that we worship more than him, and that we're going to worship something. And so the first commandment is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And he's going to literally just lay out this argument, and God going to go ahead and admit, I'm jealous. I'm jealous. God is just like a man who takes care of a woman, pledges marries her, put her rings on her finger, and provides for her, and be her priest, her protector, and her provider, and then she goes out and betrays him. He is very ticked off, and he has every reason to be jealous. That's the reason why God told Hosea to go marry a hoe, to literally go marry a Gomer, because I want Israel to know how it feels to be betrayed when you give her your best, when you do everything for her. And Hosea, in order to put weight on what you tell them that I'm telling you, I need you to feel my pain. And I want you to feel how it feels to be betrayed when you a good man to a bad woman, who you love, who you rescue, who you save, who you keep, who you protect, who you try to guide. I want you to know how I feel. And so in the book of Hosea, he said, I want you to go out and marry that woman, and that woman is going to betray you. She's going to go back to prostitution, go back to her old lifestyle. And then when she go back, when she's at her worst, I want you to go back and get her. Do I have any witnesses in here? God wanted him to know how he felt. God says, I'm a jealous God. God admits his jealousy. He admits his possessiveness of his people, that he loves them, and he don't want Israel treating any other God. He says in this verse 3, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And if your Bible is like my Bible, the word me is capitalized. So that means God talking about himself. Don't be going out here cheating on me. Don't be going out here running after somebody that ain't me. Don't be giving your devotion and loyalty to anybody but me. I better not find out you sleeping behind me, behind my back. I better not find out that you're giving to somebody else what you owe me. Because I'm the one that came to Egypt and brought you out. I'm the one that got you from under bondage. I better not find out that you done put anybody before me. That's like a woman going over to her man's house and cooking, washing his clothes and cleaning up his house, but won't even clean up the house of the man that she married to. Do I have any witnesses in here? Do I have any witnesses in here? Don't put anybody else first. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Verse 4 says, thou shalt not make any graven images or any likenesses. Now, I can stop right here, and I probably will, but let me tell you something. This is a powerful one. That you don't have no other gods before me. Don't put your devotion, your love, your commitment toward anything else more than you put it toward me. Because he talks about I'm a jealous God. And God was so serious about this. He said, I will visit iniquities until the third and fourth generation. If you start treating me like I got second class citizen status, but I ought to be first in your life. You ought to put me out front. If anybody you ought to be devoted to is me. Anybody you ought to be committed to, it is me. Because I'm the one that butters your bread. I'm the one that keeps a roof over your head, clothes on your back. I'm the one that brought you and kept you. I'm the one that performed miracle after miracle. I'm the one that heard your cry and rescued you and brought you out. You owe it to me to keep me first, to be devoted to me, to be committed to me, and to keep me on. Yes, Lord. Come on now. But he says, you shall not make any graven images. Now, I wish I had time to explain this to you, my brothers and sisters. Don't make God small. That's really what he's saying. Don't try to make an image and let that image be a representation of who God is. Because when you do, you box God in. You make God small. You listen. If you can tote it in your hand, it ain't God. If you can box it in, it ain't God. If it's got to be carried, it ain't God. You remember when Jacob left the house of Laban, and you remember he got some of the gods of Laban off the mantle in his house and took them with him, and Laban would panic because his gods had left his house. And so he started running after the caravan and said, where is my God? And my brothers and sisters, I wouldn't have a God that I had to carry. I need a God that can carry me. I don't need a God that can fit in my pocket. I need a God that I can fit in his hand. I don't need a God that is made of silver and gold wood, but I need a God that is able to transcend wood and gold and metal. A God that is able to be everywhere at the same time, not have to leave anywhere to go anywhere because he's everywhere at the same time. I need a God who knows everything. He can talk to everybody at the same time. Don't make me small. Don't make me into an image. You got to be careful what you worship, because most people have to see before they'll worship. But the God we serve is an invisible God. God is like air. You can't see him, but he's there. You hear him. And he is real. But let me tell you, and you got to trust him. You can't make him a graven image. If I had time, I'd move a little forward to tell you the first thing they did when Moses went up to get the commandments. The first thing that he saw when he came back, they had fashioned a golden calf to represent God. And they had began to fall down and worship that golden image. Now let me tell you, only God would have known that that's the first thing they would have done, that they would have fasted. And so he said to them, don't make any image to represent me, because I'm greater than any image. You might wear a cross, but God is greater than that cross on your neck. You might have a picture of Jesus in your house, a European Jesus with long streaming hair, and that might be the object of your worship. But God is greater than that image you got hanging on the wall. Don't make God something you can hold. God is something that can hold you. Don't make, he says, and he said, don't bow down to it, verse 5, and don't serve them. He talks about don't serve these gods, because he says them. He says them in verse 5. Don't serve these gods, little G-O-D-S, and don't serve these images. Boy, I could really get into this prosperity gospel and how we love materialism and things and cars and clothes and cash and houses, and we have become We have become devoted to getting those things. Those things are the objects of our devotion and our commitment and our focus. We want material things more than we want God. We want the things God has created more than we want the God who created it. We have made things into gods, and we have made these images that we have made into gods, and we worship them according to the text. We serve them, and that gets on the nerve of God. That gets the attention of God. It aggravates God that we serve what he has created more than the creator. We love to serve and worship gods in images. We give our devotion to things that Jesus said rust and moth will come in and take away, because he says in verse 5, for I am a jealous God. And listen, I ain't gonna play. I ain't gonna play with you. You owe me. And I ain't gonna let you put gods or images before me. Listen, I've got to move on. And then he says, don't take my name in vain. Boy, let me tell you something. That's a pretty powerful one. In verse 7, he says, don't take my name in vain. In other words, don't let the name of God become so common that it's no longer sacred. That's simply what that means. You can use God's name in such a careless way that it doesn't have the same meaning and the gravitas, and it doesn't have the same sacredness when you call on the name of God. The Jewish people had such a reverence for the name of God. A Jewish rabbi, whenever they would write a text or whenever they would sit down to pen any religious material, whenever they would come to the name of God, it was so sacred that they would get up, they would take a bath, they would change their garments, they would literally cleanse themselves, and the pen that they was using when they got to the name of God, they would discard that pen, they would put on new clothes, they would clean themselves and pick up a whole new pen just to write the name of God, because it was so sacred to them, it was so holy to them. They did not take God's name in vain, because how can you take the name of a God who will be there for you, rescue you when you really need it? Peter said when he was sinking, when he got out of the boat in a storm, he said, Lord, save me, and God saved him. How can you take that name in vain? His name is sacred, and it needs to stay sacred. It's more than just cussing. It's how you feel and how you use the name of God. The word vain literally means empty. Just be careful how you use his name. And I don't want to talk about this because I get in trouble, but some of these modern day apostles and prophets talking about what the Lord said. That's empty, because God doesn't speak outside of the revelation of the inspiration of his word. You got to be careful how you use the name of God, talking about what God told you and what God said, because God can speak for himself, and you take God's name recklessly and carelessly, and you use God's name for the sake of profit and making money and literally commoditizing the name of God. And in the name of God, people have done some real bad things. They have taken God's name in vain. And then I've got to close when I tell you God had one more thing to say. He told you how to worship. And then he told you what not to worship. But then God's going to tell you when to worship. Because verse number 8, listen, I got to close when I tell you this. And this is the last one. And it looks like this is unrelated to the first two. But my brothers and sisters, if you give a closer examination, God says to the children of Israel, remember the Sabbath day. And I couldn't wait to get here to explain to you the etymology and the Hebrew meaning of the word Sabbath. The word Sabbath means to stop. It means to halt. It means to cease doing everything else. It literally means to shut down. It doesn't mean to pause, but it literally means to stop, to do nothing. He says, on this day, don't do anything else, but remember me. Oh, if I had time, I'd explain to you. We have become so commercial in this Western culture that we do everything every day, and it ain't a day that we don't exclude doing everything. But he says there are some days, or there is a day when you need to stop everything else that you were doing on the 6 days. But on this day, on this 7th day, this day is set aside for me. And my brothers and sisters, if I had time, I'd explain to you that he says, thou shalt have no other God. Thou shalt not make any graven images. You shall not bow down or serve them. But he says, when you ought to remember me is on the Sabbath day. And that word Sabbath means to stop. Whatever it is you were doing, try not to do what you did on the 6 other days. This day is special to me. And listen, I really need you to get you to understand just how special this day is to God. If you are married and if your husband forgets your anniversary, he is in trouble. Because your anniversary is a special day, because that was the day when you said yes. And listen, that's the day you want him to remember. If he forget all other 364 days, he better not forget that day. That's the day when you said yes. It is a special day to you, and your birthday is a special day to some people in your life. If they forget your birthday, they are in trouble. Days are special to us because they have a special meaning to us, and the Sabbath day is special to God. And God wants us to stop. Because he says in this verse, 6 days you labor and do all your work, but on this 7th day is a Sabbath where you stop. It's the day the Lord wants you to give it to him. And he says, not only you, but all that is under your control and stewardship. And boy, he started naming off some stuff. Listen, your son shouldn't work, your daughter shouldn't work, your male servant shouldn't work, your female servant shouldn't work, and you shouldn't even make your cows work. He says your cattle, your livestock, nothing within your gates, and not even a stranger. If a stranger comes, he ought to be able to do as least as possible and enjoy your hospitality, because he says this is my day. And then God's going to give a rationale and a reason, because he says in 6 days I done my work, but the 7th day I rest. The 7th day I stop. I stopped creating. I stopped working, because it was time, because I had done all that was needed and necessary, and I rested. And really what it really means, rest is not the kind of words where it talks about rest and relaxation, but it is about reflection. It really is about rejoicing. It's really about worshiping. It's really about looking back reflectively and retrospectively to see that all you have did, you've done. And now it's time to sit back and look over that, to give back reflection and to give recognition. And my brothers and sisters, we need one day where we can retrospectively look back to see all that God has done. Listen, he woke us up on Monday. He kept us on Tuesday. He preserved us on Wednesday, got us through on Thursday, and Friday we made it. Saturday we had time to do what we needed to do, but Sunday morning came, and I need to explain to you why we don't serve on the Sabbath, which is Saturday, which the Jews served on. I need to explain to you, according to Paul, explain to the Corinthians why we are no longer under the law, why we no longer serve on the Sabbath, but we serve on Sunday, which is the first day of the week. And if I had time, I'd explain to you. We don't serve on the Sabbath. We don't remember the Sabbath. It's the only commandment that Jesus did not repeat in the New Testament, because he knew what he was going to do on the cross. Do I have any witnesses in here? And the reason why the Seventh-day Adventist is wrong is because we're no longer under the law, but we're under grace. And we don't celebrate necessarily the Sabbath on Saturday, but we celebrate the resurrection on Sunday. And we come to church because we remember what he did Sunday morning. He died on Friday, was buried, and stayed in the grave all day Saturday, all Saturday night, but early Sunday morning, he got up with all power in his hand, and the New Testament church no longer under the law, but now under grace. And we celebrate who redeemed us. We celebrate the sacrifice that made things right with God. We celebrate that Jesus died. But more than that, we celebrate that he got up. That's why we here this morning. We here as Jesus celebrate. We here to come together because of what he did for us on that cross. And we owe this day to God. Because 6 days he give us. And all he asks of us is one day out of 7. To come to celebrate. We come to celebrate our redemption. We come to celebrate Jesus. But more than that, and I'm closing, we come to celebrate our God. Thank God that he died. He died for us. Every head bowed and every eye closed. God expects us to serve him and serve him only. God expects us not to make any graven